the elite slaves and the menials and the subcategories that are there within them. Then the European accounts that we've got on this institution, the travelers' accounts, and I'll then go on briefly towards the Mughals, dealing with Akbar's measures of social equity and the impact that they have on slavery as an institution. So coming to the sources, firstly, the earliest source that we've got, which is fairly well documented, are the Lekh Padhati records. They date back to the 12th century Chalukyan kingdom of Gujarat, and these records shed light upon the nature of this institution, and they give us sale deeds of slave girls. So we have 4 sale deeds, and in the first 2 we hear about 2 slave girls being captured in the raids and then enslaved, sold off. Then in the third one, that is a very significant one, because we come to know about a girl from a Rajputra caste, and she was abandoned by her father and then by also her husband, so she had to go on for begging. She had to resort to begging. And then we see that there was the plunder by the Malechas and the Rashtrakutas. So as a result, then there was also famine in Gujarat. So as a result, the situation became so dire that she had to voluntarily sell herself as a slave. Apart from this, we've got a fourth sale deed. So in this one, we see that there is a girl who was abandoned after she lost her husband and other relatives. She was sold by her master to another as a slave. So apart from this, these records also tell us about what the works and what the tasks they had to do. So there were pure and impure works, the pure works ranging from bringing fodder, hand-picking grain and rice and that kind of the domestic chores basically. Then the impure work going on to cleaning human excreta, and then there were also the sexual activities that the slaves were forced to perform for the masters. Then apart from this, we also come to know from these documents that if a slave committed suicide because of the torture from the master, then she would after rebirth she would become a Chandali, whereas the master would be deemed as pure as if he had taken a bath in the Ganga. So this tells us about the aspect that they were not even free after death, these slaves. So once, this is the first well-documented source that we've got from the early medieval period. Then coming to the records from the Islamic aid world. So we have Tarikh-e-Yamani describing the raids of Sultan Mahmud, and apart from that, the plunder which took place in those raids. And then it also mentions the merchants coming from Mavra and Neher, and they were transporting, or they were dealing with Indian slaves in the Indian subcontinent. So this gives us a highlight of the trade. Then we have the sources from the Sultanate. After the establishment of the Sultanate, we see that there is Minhaj, and then there is Gurney, who discuss this institution in passing references. So in case of Minhaj, we see that firstly he gives the biographical account of 25 nobles, which are the slave officers of Iltutmish, the Turkani-Chehardani. Then we also have secondly a biographical account of Hindu Bey, a slave of Iltutmish again. Then another incident which Minhaj narrates is about the fact that he had to go from the imperial capital, that is Delhi, to Multan to dispatch 40 slaves for his dear sister who used to live in Khurasan at that time. So it gives us an inkling about the kind of slave trade, the overland slave trade that existed at that period of time. Then coming towards Burney, he gives us the economic aspects of slavery. And he gives us the categories that we have, the elites and menials and the prices, the fluctuation in those prices. So then from Burney, we come to the Mughal sources. In the beginning, we have Babur mentioning in his Tuzuk-e-Babri that the Bukharan market was full of Indian slaves. So this suggests that the trade was still going on. Though the markets had declined by the decline of the Sultanate, the markets were still, the trade was still going on. So then coming to the Ain directly, we have the decrees by Akbar in his 7th regnal year, that is 1562-63. So there he gives the orders of abolition of slavery and slave trade. So apart from this, these are the official records that we've got. Apart from this, we've got certain letters and certain unofficial evidences as well. So in these, like we have letters, 2 letters from Hakim Abul Fateh Jilani. In first letter, he writes it to a friend of his who is living in Fatehpur Sikri, and the Hakim is writing from the imperial capital. So he asks his friend to purchase for him or to acquire for him a da or a female concubine, because he was unable to acquire one after the measures had been passed. Then later, the next letter dates to a while after this first letter. In the next letter, he writes it to his brother, and he states that if he is willing to lend or he is willing to give his one or both of his female concubines to his brother who does not have a son yet. So through this we can understand that even aristocrats, after the measures of Akbar, even aristocrats like Hakim Abul Fateh Jilani had difficulty in acquiring slaves. So these measures were being taken up seriously in the vicinity of Agra at least. Then apart from this, we've got an incident by Rafiuddin Shirazi in Tazkiratul Muluk. So in this, he narrates the incident in this way that one of his friends sold a slave in the vicinity of Agra, and then when the Kotwal of Delhi came to know about this, he got that person's ears cut and then pasted on the wall of the fort of Agra. So this was basically a warning for the people to adhere to the regulations that had been passed. So these are the sources. Apart from this, there are the European sources, for example, Caesar Frederick's record and Ralph Phillips' record. Then we come to the nature of slavery. So the basic generating factors for slavery were war, famines, poverty, abductions before the Sultanate. Well, during the Sultanate, mainly the plundering raids were the ones which generated the maximum amount of slaves. Then with the establishment of the Sultanate, when the new migrants came to the continent, they needed a docile and trainable labor, according to Professor Irfan Hatib, and this also facilitated overland slave trade. So the new immigrants needed a servile labor which could help produce for them the same kind of things that they had been familiar with in their own territories. So this docile labor was provided by slavery, by the slaves that were there. So we see the development of slave markets with the coming of the Sultanate, and there was basically a demand from the Turkish ruling class and the town-based urbanized people, not only the Turks but also the common people. So as a result, we see that there were plundering raids. For example, we have the raids of Balban in 1267-68, the raids of Kampil and Patiali. So after this, it is said that such a lot of plunder was generated that the slaves became cheap. And Zia Burni tells us about the prices of the slaves at that point of time. So he states that due to abundant supply, the prices were so low under Alauddin that a female slave went for 8 tankas, a concubine went for 15 tankas, and adolescent slave boys went only for 4 dirhams. So apart from this, we can understand that with urbanization and the establishment of the Sultanate, the growing urbanized society created a growing demand for slaves, and this resulted in a plentitude of slaves which made them affordable to people of even modest means. So this is basically the economic aspect of slavery that we see with the coming of the Sultanate. And when the Sultanate comes towards the decline in the 16th century onwards, we see that these markets gradually decline as perhaps the need of slaves was declining, and it was limited mostly to the domestic sector. So with the coming of the Mughal era, we see that Babur does not mention any slave markets existing in the vicinity of the capital when he conquers it after Ibrahim Lodi. So then, apart from Babur, we also have European travelers, but none of the European travelers indicate the presence or the prevalence of a slave market in the capitals or in anywhere in the part of the newly conquered territory by the Mughals. So, with the coming of the Mughals, we see that slavery is restricted to the domestic sector. Then, when we see the time of Akbar, Akbar takes certain measures of abolition of slavery. So these measures are they are not in a vacuum. They are according to the circumstances that are prevailing. So this is what the development of slavery throughout from the Sultanate to the Mughal period till the abolition of slavery was under Akbar. Then when we come towards the types of slaves, Ziawarni, not only does he go on about with the prices of the slaves, he also tells us about certain categories that were there amongst the slaves. For instance, there were the menial or the ordinary slaves, and then there were the elite slaves. So in the menials, we see the ordinary slaves doing work, the domestic chores mainly. They were cheaply priced. They were sold in the common Delhi slave market, and they had to do work like picking the grain, rice, hand milling grain, spinning, and all these kind of things. So the women that were captured in raids, they were mostly used as domestic slaves, and being from the villages, they were rustic in manners. So as a result, they were usually used as domestic slaves, but in the cases of lower aristocracy, they were also used as concubines. Then we also have these domestic slaves acting as agents of business for their masters if they were educated to a certain extent. Apart from this, we have the elite slaves. Now the elite slaves were valuable for their military and educational accomplishments, and they were purchased for great positions either in the army or in the government or in other important sectors, for instance in the harem. Then we have the elite slaves. Amongst the elite slaves, we've got two types of slaves, two subdivisions of categories. Like we have the military slaves and the eunuchs, and then there is another category which is that of the concubines. So in case of military slaves, we have examples of Qutubuddin Aibak, Yildoz and Qubacha as the military slaves of Muizuddin bin Sam, and then we have Iltutmish as another example of the slave of Qutubuddin Aibak. So these slaves were extremely well trained in the military domain, and they could rise up to the position of Iqtidars and Sultan itself. Then even we have Balban as a very good example, because at that point of time they could rise to a position so as to impose danger to the position of the Sultan itself. Then we have, by the time we go towards the Mughals, we see that this trajectory changes a little, because by this time the slaves are there, military slaves are there, as Akbar inherited many slaves from Babur and Humayun, but no military slave is rising to such a mansab or to such a position so as to pose danger to the position of the king or the emperor, or as a very important or significant noble. An example that we have of this is Peshwa Khan under Akbar. He was a gift to Humayun from Shah Temaz. After this, we have the eunuchs. Now they were used for the female quarters for guarding the Zanan Khanas, and Ibn Battuta gives us an incident. He narrates that his concubine was taken in a palanquin to the harem of the Sultan's mother by eunuchs. Marco Polo also describes the use of eunuchs in the household of the imperial establishment and important under the aristocracy. Then we have eunuchs coming from Malabar and Bengal. That was the main trading center for eunuchs. Babur reports that a profit of about 300 to 400% was gained from the frontier towns of Kabul and Kandahar, and they became trading marts for the Indian caravans which were dealing with slaves like eunuchs especially. So apart from this, we have eunuchs coming up till the time of Jahangir from Malabar and Bengal. So these were elite slaves mainly used for the harem. In some cases, they were even used as military commanders. For example, we have Malik Kafur for Alauddin Khalji. Then the concubines. Now the concubines were expensive or sold at exorbitant prices, and at times they became common items of sale if the prices declined. So at times they were sold in the Delhi slave mart, but the range was only from 15 to 2,000 tankas. However, when we see the elite concubines, they were not ordinary women. They were the markers of the Sultan's sovereignty, and they were even women from erstwhile ruling families. The harems of the subjugated or the vanquished ruler were taken in, and the women were enslaved and kept as concubines in the harem. So they were ornamental pieces for the harem basically, and they had cultural and literary accomplishments. Apart from this, their physical attributes were extremely important. They were beautiful women and choices of the female slaves, and at many times they were of exotic origins. Some were Abyssinian, Caucasian, Greek, etc. So by the time of Akbar, we see that this slavery declines a little and is confined more towards the domestic aspect or towards the harem mostly. Then in 1562-63, we see that Akbar takes up the measures of prohibition of the enslavement of women and children of the opposing soldiery. And then by 1582, he liberates a large number of slaves, and then they were called, from then onwards, they were called the chelas. Then we also have records like the European records, which are from Caesar Frederick and Ralph Filch. They report the Cambay famine, and which occurred from 1560s to 80s. So they state that there was a sale of infants for the sake of food. And then in 1574-75, this was the sale of infants was there. So after this, even Arif Kandhari also supports this, and he, writing in 1580, he tells us about the sale of a gentle bond for a loaf of bread, but none were willing to buy it. So we have a whole trajectory about slavery still being prevalent because of the famines. This gives us an environmental aspect of the famines which these famines would have had on slavery. So by 1594, we see that Akbar issued a decree regarding the circumstances of the selling of these children, and he stated that the parents who had these means to take back their children and to repay the dealer, they could take back their children and they wouldn't be stopped in this. So these are Akbar's measures regarding the abolition of slavery. However, these measures are with thorough consideration, and they are not in a vacuum. So we see that although we see with Akbar that there are first flickers of the critique of traditional India, the first flickers of Indian Renaissance, as Professor Irfan Habib states. However, these measures are in accordance with the norms of the age, because at that period of time there was an attempt on the part of the emperor to project the state as a benevolent state, as a protector of the weak. And then there is the egalitarian aspect that we see the theologians debating whether the sale of free bonds, that is ghur faroshi, was legal or not. So there is an egalitarian aspect that we have from the point of Akbar. But slavery still continues. Within certain bounds and limits, slavery still continues, and the imperial establishment continued to receive slaves. And even though Jahangir prided himself in banning the practice of the creation of eunuchs, we see that Jahangir continued to receive eunuchs from Bengal and Malabar. So by the 17th century, due to deficit, slavery and enslavement was carried out on a larger scale, and there were raids in the recalcitrant areas, and there was enslavement of the peasantry. However, all this is comparatively lesser than what we see in the Sultanate. We do not have any properly organized markets by the time the Mughals are there. And however, slavery as an institution does continue. Thank you. Any questions or comments?